Human visual attention is typically associated with the notion that the viewer's goals and salient objects draw our attention in our visual fields. An example of salient objects are colorful signs or an individual in an unusual costume. These salient objects draw our attention, and the pervasive psychological theory about how we process them is the dichotomy of top-down and bottom-up processing.
Top-down processing involves active cognition, where our expectations and previous experiences are used to recognize stimuli. Bottom-up processing begins with sensory input, where we process the parts of an object to form a whole percept. This dichotomy of how we perceive the world is challenged by value-driven attentional capture, or VDAC.
The concept of value-driven attentional capture suggests that subjects can be trained to imbue certain stimuli with value. These value-imbued stimuli later capture our attention. These stimuli are typically associated with money. This concept of visual processing shows that the human visual and perceptual processes are not simply limited to top-down processing and bottom-up processing. In a study conducted by Edward Ah et al., they concluded that in conjunction with the physical saliency of objects associated with top-down and bottom-up processing, the goals of participants as well as their object search histories had a significant effect on their attentional capture. This innate value we place on objects monetarily or otherwise has a great deal of influence on how we perceive the world.
With the help of fMRI scanning, Anderson et al. Was able to replicate his original experiment and measure the activation in different areas of the brain. They hypothesized using a whole brain approach that previously rewarded distractors would most significantly activate the visual cortex. The result of his experiment showed that participants had significant activation in the tail of the caudate nucleus and extrastriate visual cortex when they were presented with distractors that were previously associated with reward. These findings are unique because the caudate tail is not activated during goal-directed or stimulus-driven attention.
Following his discovery on the activation of the caudate tail and the extrastriate visual cortex, Anderson et al. Conducted another experiment to explore the role of dopamine release in value-driven attentional capture. It is well documented that reward learning is associated with dopamine release in the ventral striatum. The neurochemical networks that are active during specific attention to previously learned reward cues had not yet been discovered. Using PET scanning, Anderson et al. Recreated a version of their initial experiment and displayed a correlation across individuals with regard to changes in the D2 and D3 dopamine receptors when they were presented with task-irrelevant distractors. These dopamine receptors have been shown to be correlated with the distractor processing in the right caudate and the posterior putamen.
The study which sets the stage for the subsequent value-driven attentional capture experiments was done by Anderson et al. In 2011. Their experiment had a training phase and 3 follow-up experiments. The training phase consisted of target shapes in a sea of randomly colored shapes. The targets were either red or green, laid out in a circular array on a screen. The experimenter's goal in doing this was to control for color saliency. The participant's goal was to indicate the orientation of a bar inside of these target shapes. This would be either horizontal or vertical, using a keyboard as quickly as they could. Correct responses were given a monetary reward, with 80% of the responses resulting in a high probability of high reward and 20% resulting in a low probability of low reward. These responses, high and low, were therefore associated with either the color red or green.
The goal of the training phase was to force the participants to associate reward with a high value color to which they had been assigned. The results of this training phase indicated that neither color, red or green, was more salient. In the test phase, there was an array of shapes arranged similarly to the training phase. In the array was a shape singleton, the target, and 5 non-salient colored distractors. Their hypothesis was that should the color previously associated with high reward be present, then the reaction time of identifying the orientation of the line within the shape singleton would be slowed. The results supported this hypothesis as the presence of the value-imbued stimulus significantly slowed reaction times without a speed-accuracy trade-off. An experiment done by Andrew Miranda and Evan M. Palmer in 2013 on intrinsic motivation and game-like features indicated that participant motivation is another challenge that most psychological labs face, and that flat participation fee does not motivate participants to perform optimally. The results show that the sound in conjunction with points was the best option for attentional capture, and that sound alone is better than just arbitrary points alone.
A second paper, authored by Xia and Zhang, continued to challenge the value dependence of value-driven attentional capture. The use of the original Anderson paradigm yielded results indicating that participants' reaction times during the task slowed when the previous target color was present, even in the absence of monetary reward. Moreover, their second experiment, which failed to replicate the accepted result as reward-based training, did not ultimately produce value-driven attentional capture in the subsequent test phase of the task.
The goal of the experiment done by Grubb and Li was to replicate and verify the role of accuracy-based feedback approach to value-driven attentional capture in a given independent sample. The intention in doing so was to assess whether positive feedback that was administered on a trial-by-trial basis during training was necessary to elicit attentional capture.
The findings showed that there was indeed attentional capture by unrewarded targets following limited accuracy-based training. The background study was intended to determine whether performance-contingent reward impacts strategic balancing of speed and accuracy. They used the short value-driven attentional capture paradigm from Anderson, experiment number 3, and added a control group that only received correct or incorrect feedback during training. The results demonstrated significant capture by stimuli that were never associated with monetary reward.
This experiment replicated the methods presented in the background study, except in this case there were two separate groups that received accuracy-based feedback during the training phase. The first group was identical to the background study with responses such as correct, incorrect, and too slow displayed on the screen, while the second group received feedback that said either incorrect or too slow.
The sample size for this experiment was 80 participants, and participants conducted the experiment from a distance of 60 centimeters away from the monitor and rested their chins on a chin rest.
The independent variable was the training phase feedback as well as the training phase target feedback. The dependent variable was the average reaction times on correct trials and the error rate. For analyses, they used a mixed design analysis of variance known as an ANOVA. These two mixed designs were the training phase target status within subjects and the training phase feedback type between subjects factor. They also used non-parametric randomized tests.
For the graph on the left, or graph A, the y-axis shows the difference in response time for the training phase between the target present and the target absent trials. The x-axis represents each individual. Graph B, on the right, shows the feedback type group means and the error bars, which display bootstrapped 95% confidence intervals.
After 240 trials, the presence of an unrewarded training phase target slowed reaction times and decreased accuracy irrespective of whether positive feedback was administered.
For each of the 4 null results and the interaction effects for the 3 mixed design ANOVAs, there was a positive evidence in favor of the null hypothesis and for the 2 within subjects effects. They found very strong and weak evidence in favor of the alternative hypothesis, which stated that the training phase target slowed response time and decreased accuracy when a former target was present as a distractor. The weak evidence found for a change in accuracy is not problematic for this interpretation, because the purpose of the accuracy-focused analysis was to rule out the possibility of a speed-accuracy trade-off in response time. This Bayesian statistical approach and those who found with the null hypothesis significance testing supported the same conclusions.
To briefly recap, the goals of this experiment were to replicate and verify the role of accuracy-based feedback in approach to value-driven attentional capture in an independent sample, and to assess whether positive feedback administered on a trial-by-trial basis during training is necessary to elicit attentional capture.
No evidence was found that positive feedback during training is required to trigger attentional capture during the test phase. These results support the selection history hypothesis while refuting the results of several control experiments conducted in previous value-driven attentional capture studies. Specific types of accuracy-based feedback is irrelevant. Attention is captured regardless of feedback type.
So, given these considerations, it is important to continue to investigate whether value-driven attentional capture is really value-driven or whether this phenomenon can be better attributed to phenomena like selection history.
Another area of future exploration, according to Grubb and Li, involves the interaction between selection history and nonspecific monetary reward. Some of the limitations of these types of experiments are replicability, sample sizes, and participant incentive. Grubb and Li's work was thorough in learning from the previous experiments, and this was shown by them addressing all of the possible limitations. Often experiments are conducted and the results cannot be replicated, or there are too many variables in the experiment to recreate the exact conditions. However, Grubb and Li were able to replicate Anderson et al.'s experiment with a larger sample size. This takes us to their sample size of 80 people. This is nearly 4 times the average sample size of the previous experiments, making their data significantly more comprehensive. Getting a large representative sample size is often challenging, and individuals in a small sample size can drastically affect experimental results. And finally, participant incentive. The experiment done by Andrew Miranda and Evan M. Palmer in 2013 on intrinsic motivation and game-like features indicated that participant motivation is difficult and that a flat participation fee does not motivate participants to perform optimally. This was accounted for by Grubb and Li by making participants' rewards performance dependent.